Up until now, we've been talking about rehearsal strategies and conducting technique, but there's really something much bigger that we haven't discussed yet, although it was good that we had an introduction to those techniques. What I'm talking about is the idea of score study, knowing the score. And there's two ways that we need to know the score. The first way is knowing what the note should sound like, the rhythm should sound like, the basic building blocks of what is this piece supposed to sound like at all. The second part of score study is having interpretive decisions made about every single note. So not just knowing that that's supposed to be a B flat on beat 3, but what kind of B flat? What's the style, the balance, the articulation, and those sorts of things. These are two separate skills. Admittedly, we can go into rehearsal and, for lack of a better word, just wing it. And go in and just react to what we hear. Say, oh, that doesn't sound good. There must be a wrong note there, and fix it. And look at the page while we're conducting and say, oh, there's a crescendo there, and we need to do more of a crescendo. And sometimes we have to do this purely reactive sort of conducting. But if we truly want to be efficient, we need to study the score in advance. And I know for myself that my most effective, efficient rehearsals are the ones where I've done my score study and I've used that score study to plan the rehearsal. If I just wing it, I usually find that the rehearsal is not as good. And often I know if I come out of rehearsal and think, boy, that was not a very good rehearsal, it's often my fault because I didn't study well enough or plan well enough. You probably can guess by now that the best way to score study is the old mantra of macro, micro, macro. So a three-part setup to this. The initial macro, when we first discover a piece, we're opening the score for the first time and we're looking at it, is just to get a basic roadmap of how the piece is constructed. And so we would start with, okay, what's the title of the piece, of course? Why is it called that? Why was it written? Who commissioned it? Who's the composer? What sorts of things has he or she composed before? When was this written? Is this a style that's new to the composer? All these basic background information is the first thing we need to know. If there are notes in the score, we should read them right off the bat so we understand the background, and that can prepare us for what we're about to see. Then we want to take a walkthrough of the score. Just flipping through, looking how it's constructed. Okay, it starts at this tempo, then there's a transition to a second part. We can hum some melodies, sing some accompanimental rhythms, start looking for basic connections like, oh, there's a melody there. Oh, and I see the melody appears again in the bass voices later on. Look at tempo relationships, transitions, fermatas, movements, titles of movements, a basic overview of the piece. The question becomes, what many people ask at this point is, should we use recordings? And there's multiple ways of looking at this. What we can probably all agree on is that you should not use recordings as your primary way of score studying, in terms of just, all right, I open the piece, stick on the recording, and just keep listening to the recording until I think I know the piece. That's not a good approach. Some people will say, never use recordings. Just do it completely in your head. Construct the sound of the piece in your head and then construct your interpretation from there. And that's a great goal. But there is a way of using recordings efficiently without kind of imprinting someone else's interpretation of the piece on us. And that's one of the main criticisms of using recordings, that if we listen to some other recording, then we're just going to say, well, that's our interpretation, and then we relinquish our own interpretive rights to the piece. It also, using recording, can hide inner voices. So if we're using it to really know what the piece sounds like, well, maybe the recording doesn't play that third clarinet part strong enough so you can hear what's going on there. Maybe there's something that's hidden in the recording, and only by us really digging in, which we'll see in a second, can we find out what the piece sounds like. However, if we're going to use a recording, at this stage, it could be useful to just listen to it once, maybe twice, and if twice, preferably two different recordings to prevent that imprint of a specific interpretation early on after our initial walkthrough, just to jumpstart our study of the piece, to create the overall sound world that we're about to inhabit and just put us on the right track. All right, so we've started that first macro process, the essential, vital information about the piece. We've done a walkthrough of the piece and gotten a sense. We've hummed, sung a couple of melodies, perhaps just worked through a couple of interesting, tricky rhythms. Now we're ready to go into the micro phase. And the micro phase is where we, as you'd expect, we zoom in on the specifics of the piece. This is really the most painstaking work that we're going to do in score study, and it does take time. It's not something that you're going to do in one sitting. Depending on the piece, it might take you weeks of doing hours and hours of this sort of study. And everyone has their own personal way of doing this, so I'm going to give you one roadmap or one way of doing it, but you're eventually going to find your own way. And our eventual goal is to just be able to open the score and hear it in our head. But that's a process we have to work towards. So what I like to do is you have to make sure that you know what every single voice sounds like. If there are 12 lines on the score, you want to know what every single person is playing, not just what the homogenized or combined version of it is that we hear from the recording. We want to hear, what does the second violin part sound like? Because that helps us fit that second violin part into the cello part. And that'll help us know, okay, not only do they have different melodies, but there's a dissonance that's created by their two voices. And we can only hear that dissonance if we know their parts individually and are able to combine them and then add other parts to the whole until we eventually combine the piece into what it really sounds like. So it's important to sing or play, perhaps the piano, through every single part. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be the most beautiful singing or playing. It doesn't even have to be at tempo. I'll often get to the piano and I'm not primarily a pianist, and I'll just hack through a part or a harmony and just see what it sounds like out of context, and then I play another part. I'll play just the melody. What's the main melody? I'll play the bass line. I'll eventually start combining the melody and the bass line. So I'm creating what I will call the lead sheet version of the piece, kind of the jazz lead sheet where you have a bunch of chords and you have the melody. And that's the piece. The stuff in between is the interesting filler and things like that. But essentially we have to know what the melody is and what the harmony is like. So I'll start playing through that. Then I'll start building harmonies. So, okay, not only is C is in the bass line, but it's part of a C major triad. And so then I'm able to play. I may not have the right voicing. I may not play exactly how it's scored, but I can play the melody and the C major chord in a big clunky version and get a sense of what it sounds like. And then that goes to, all right, D minor in first inversion. Okay, so I know not only is it a D minor chord, but I know that there is an F in the bass, and that's crucial to know that. So I'll play, it might be clunky, a D minor triad with an F in the bass, or first inversion, and the melody. So eventually I'm slowly constructing what this piece sounds like, and I'm creating a version of it that I could play at the piano and sing in my head effectively to slowly construct it. This seems like it's a lot of work for just something that the recording can give you, but there's something really important and powerful about being able to have a kinesthetic connection to what you're doing, to not only see that it's C major and hear that it's C major, but to physically create C major, either using your voice or your piano skills or even playing it on your primary instrument. So as I'm doing this, of course, I'm making notations in the score so I know later what's there. Some people like to use a separate version of the score, meaning a copy of it. So they'll take the main score, they'll make a copy, and that'll be their study version. So they can just mark it up as much as they want. And they might transfer some of that information back to their main score for rehearsal and conducting purposes, or they might not. Sometimes they just I'll use the regular score. I mean, I'll just, the main score that I'm studying off of, I'll make notations in it, and that's what I conduct in. And so I'm making notations on the harmony underneath. I might circle a note in the second trumpet part because it's a dissonant note or it's an important note. I might make notations in the margins about which voices have the same parts. So I'll say, okay, flute 1, violin 2, and trombone all share the melody. So I can see that very, very quickly. And in terms of the harmony that I'm writing, I don't necessarily use Roman numeral analysis. If you've taken a music theory class, you know Roman numeral 1 is the tonic chord. If we're in D major, 1 means D major. I don't use that because I really want to know that it's D major. So I'll write D. Now for me, I write D plus. That's my code for D major, although many people know the plus to mean augmented. But it just, whatever works for you. I don't like DM because it's just too many letters, but find some version some code that can allow you to very efficiently notate what the harmony is. So for me, D, capital D or D plus is D major, a lowercase d or D with a minus is D minor. For me, augmented happens to be D aug because you don't see them very often, and so it's a lot of letters, but I don't use it very often. Diminished, I would use the little circle, superscript circle. For half diminish, I'll use a circle with a slash through it. It's whatever works for you. It's kind of my version of jazz harmony notation. So I can quickly see that it goes from C to G. Now, if I want to point out the functional relationships, and that's important, I will also supplement it with the Roman numeral analysis below. So if I go C to G, and I know C is the tonic and G is the dominant in terms of the key, I will write a small 1 to 5, or perhaps at a cadence, I'll say 5-1. So I know, yeah, the relationship that's being created here is a dominant tonic relationship, and that's very useful to know. In terms of dissonances, well, there's lots of ways to do it. I like to sometimes, as I mentioned before, circle certain notes in the score, and I'll also write them sometimes in parentheses next to my quasi-jazz notation in the margin. And when I say margin, I'm talking about the bottom of the score. Some people like to do it at the top. I like to do it at the white space below. The top I reserve for measure numbers and phrase markings and phrase notations. Below is where I put harmonic information and things like that. Whatever works for you is what you should do. So let's say I have a D at the bottom to tell me that it's D major, and I know, though, in that chord that there's an E in there. It's not part of the chord. It's a non-harmonic tone. I will sometimes circle the E in the score in the voices that have it as a reminder to myself, and I'll also put it in parentheses next to the D. So D parentheses E, which tells me in very efficient terms that's a D major triad, and there's an E in there. Remember, when we're doing this kind of study, some of this is up to our interpretation. If you've taken theory, you know there's more than one way to spell a chord. For example, if I have, let's say, the note C, E, G, B, D. C, E, G, B, D. Well, there's more than one way to interpret that. I can interpret that as a C ninth chord, C, E, G, then the B is the seventh, and then the D is the ninth, so it's one triad. Or I can interpret it as two triads juxtaposed. It's C, E, G, and then G, B, D. That G serves as both the fifth of the C chord and the root of the G chord. The answer is, it depends what it sounds like. There's no one answer to it, which is one of the reasons it's so important to get to the piano or get into your head or to your instrument and play this stuff so you can determine, well, what does it sound like to me? Because that's really what matters. If you played at the piano and in context of the harmony, it sounds like a C ninth chord, well, then it's a C ninth chord. If to you it sounds like, no, it really sounds like two triads juxtaposed, well, then it's two triads juxtaposed. If your theory teacher says it's two triads juxtaposed and that's the answer, it doesn't really matter. It matters what it sounds like to us and how we're going to interpret it and thus rehearse it. And that's ultimately what the goal of the score study is. It informs our interpretation, which will inform how we rehearse it, which will inform and create how the ultimate performance will be. So you make some decisions like this. Sometimes, let's say there's a C, F, G. Okay, so is the C, F, G, is the F just a true dissonance in there, or is it a sus? Is it a sustained F, a suspended F that's going to resolve eventually back down to the E? Depends how you hear it. You have to just go to the piano or go to your head or go to your instrument and figure it out. So I'm constantly making decisions like this, and this will help us sell it to the group so we know, hey, here's how this thing is constructed. This thing is C over here, and that voice is dissonant, and you need to know that's dissonant and make sure you listen to who you're consonant against and who you're resolving against. These are important decisions. It also helps us in rehearsal quickly diagnose and fix problems. So if we are conducting through and we hear something is not matching what we're expecting, we can quickly go to the score and say, oh, we know it's supposed to be an E major triad. Something is not creating an E major triad. And that's one of the reasons why this jazz notation can be useful, because if it just says, let's say, 4, Roman numeral 4, then we have to do this calculation of, well, okay, what key are we in? What's the 4 chord in there? And that's not very efficient. So by just putting the letter and perhaps a supplement of the Roman numeral analysis, that helps. Of course, it's not all about harmony. There's melody. We have to know kind of what the main melodies are. We need to know the rhythms, and these are all things that we're going to break down at the micro level and just work through. And as we're doing that, we're going to be consciously and subconsciously creating connections between everything that we're seeing. And this is one of the other reasons why this is not going to happen in one sitting. Because at first, the pieces may not make sense to you. And you may not realize, hey, the melody that I see and hear in measure 6 is the same melody but twice as fast as the one that I see in measure 28. I didn't realize that until the 5th day of working through this. Or the harmony I see here is the same harmony here, except it's been altered in a certain way. Or, man, I didn't realize that this accompanimental figure is really just the melody broken up into little pieces and repeated as an ostinato. Lots of different connections we're going to find gradually. And again, that's going to shape our interpretation of the piece and going to shape how we rehearse it and how we ultimately perform. So as we go through it, we're going to be making these connections, notating them when appropriate, and then piecing together what this sounds like. Jump-started perhaps by our recording, but eventually we're going to be creating the sound world in our head. After we go through this process is when we begin to start zooming out back to the macro level. Now, all through this, we could be working through some conducting issues, except I would encourage you not to score study like this, where you're just watching the score and it all becomes about just, let me conduct my way through it. Because then we're not connecting to the music. We're just worried about what we're doing physically. And we're doing it in reverse order. Because really, we want to get the music in our head and then start constructing this. However, it can be useful to say, okay, that's a tricky rhythm. That's one, and work through with our conducting. Or if there's a transition, take a step back and say, oh, I wonder how I would conduct that. That's okay to start introducing it as we go. But you're going to be doing more of that as we start zooming out of the micro, and back into the macro. So as we do that and we're entering the macro, now is when we start figuring out, okay, what is our interpretation of this piece? And I mean that in terms of, as we've discussed in other videos, how do I want every single note, every single harmony, every single measure to sound? Not only in terms of the micro level, like that specific staccato, but what is the view of the entire piece? Is it going from here to here, or does it go from here to here, and then recede, and then go back over here, to eventually there's a valley here until we really go to the pinnacle of the piece? How do we form our interpretation? And there's more than one answer. And that's, again, why we don't want to listen to too many recordings early on, because if we do listen to too many recordings, then when we get to this stage, we're just mimicking what we heard earlier. But we want this stage to be a function of what we did in the micro stage, that we know, okay, well, I'm going to bring out this figure here because I know it's important, because I just realized that it's the same melody that we heard opening. In the opening. It's the main melody. So I'm going to bring it out here, and I'm doing it not because that recording told me to make that loud. I'm doing it because my score study has created a connection between these two lines, and thus I've made a decision that that's important, and thus it's informed my interpretation. So we're just going to work our way through, construct our idealized version of the piece, and then as we do it at this point, can we start looking at some of our conducting gestures? Because now we know what the piece should sound like to us based on what the composer wants, and now we can say, wait, what gesture do we need to create that? And that's important, not to say early on, yeah, that's what this downbeat's going to sound like, before we've decided that what that note should sound like. First, what does a note sound like? Then, what gesture can I create that evokes that sound? I mentioned just a couple sentences ago the idea of what the composer wants, and there's another video on being the composer's advocate, but make sure that's always in the back of your head as you're creating this idealized recording, that not only does it fit your interpretation of the piece, but does it also do service to what what we think the composer intends. And that's something that we have to do through our research, but we want to make sure that the composer in some ways is on our shoulder, at least to a degree, looking down at our work saying, yeah, that's reasonable. Even if they say, well, I don't know, that's not, I never thought about that, but that'll work. We don't want the composer, our imaginary composer up there to be saying, no, no, that's completely opposite what I wanted. Please do not do that. There needs to be a balance between what we want and what their intent was. All right, so we've worked on our interpretation of the piece, we've created the idealized recording, we've developed some of these gestures that are going to evoke the sound. Now what do? Well, now we want to internalize the piece as much as we can. In some ways this means memorizing it, but for the reality for most of us is that we don't have time to memorize every single piece, but somehow we want to get it internalized as much as we can. I often call this the interpretive dance phase. This is when you're essentially going to go around your house or your apartment or wherever you study and try to just physically dance to the piece, not while listening to a recording, but while listening to it in your head and perhaps using the score as a reference. So it might be, you might have a music stand there and you know what it should sound like, you know what the sound world of the piece is, and you're just going to kind of bounce around and just dance to the piece. I'm not going to do it now for you because although I won't hear you laughing, you will be laughing. This is a private sort of thing that you just want to be the piece physically. And of course, that's not only practice in terms of internalizing it and trying to get it inside our core, so we're not up here reading it this way the whole time, but it'll also generate some conducting gestures that we might be able to extract from our dance and turn into an actual physical gesture. At this point is where it might be useful to reintroduce the recordings. And because we've already created our interpretation pretty firmly in our head, and now we just want to get other ideas. We want to say, okay, what does this great conductor do? What did that ensemble do? In this case, I would recommend getting as many recordings as you possibly can. In the age of YouTube, this is easier than it used to be in iTunes, so download, find, buy as many recordings as you can so you can get as many different perspectives. And you're going to learn something from it. You might learn, you know what, that part I was studying at the piano sounds very different in reality than I have it in my head or as I pounded it out at the piano. That's good to know. You're checking your work essentially. You might also find, I never thought about taking a retard in that measure. That's interesting. Or interesting how they bring that voice out, or this connection is not what I thought it was, and you might either say, I'm going to steal that, or I reject that. But at least you're going to get some good ideas, hopefully, and you're going to get a wide variety of them, so we're not imprinting just one of them. Score study is not easy. I found early on it took me much longer than I really wanted to get through a piece, and the more I did it, the more I came up with my own tactics, shortcuts in a good way, and became more efficient at doing this. So practice your score study, but know that the more you score study and the more you know the piece, the more effective your rehearsals are going to be, and the less we're going to just be reacting and creating sound in rehearsal.